The old canvas arrived at the museum carefully crated, a prized new acquisition. It was an 1882 family portrait, a piece that promised a glimpse into the late Victorian era. On first look, it was just what you'd expect. A stern-faced father, his elegant wife, and their two small children, a boy and a girl, standing primly before a lush, if somewhat dark, garden backdrop. This was the Blackwood family, or so the plaque would read. The painting was a fine example of its time, skillfully rendered with a quiet dignity that spoke of wealth and propriety. It had passed through generations, always cared for, always admired, and now it was ready for its public debut. Before any masterpiece goes on display, it undergoes a thorough cleaning and restoration. This is standard procedure, a careful process where art conservators, with their specialized tools and steady hands, remove years of accumulated grime, old varnish, and minor damage. When the Blackwood portrait was wheeled into the conservation lab, the head conservator, Dr. Eleanor Vance, felt the usual mix of excitement and respect. The painting was in remarkably good shape for its age. The colors, though muted by time, still held a certain depth, and the brushwork was precise. It seemed like a straightforward job, a chance to bring a beautiful piece of history back to its original glory. The initial stages involved surface cleaning, a delicate process using specialized solutions to lift away dust and superficial dirt without harming the original paint. Eleanor and her team worked methodically, their soft brushes and cotton swabs moving in slow, precise motions across the canvas. They admired the artist's technique, the way light caught the folds of the mother's dress, the subtle hint of a smile on the boy's face. Everything about the painting screamed quality, a testament to a forgotten artist's skill. It was during the removal of an older yellowed layer of varnish that the first anomaly appeared. Eleanor was working near the bottom edge of the painting, right where the children stood, their small shoes just visible beneath the hem of their clothes. She noticed a faint discoloration, a slight difference in texture, almost like a smudge. But it wasn't on the surface. It seemed to be under the varnish, embedded in the paint layers beneath. She paused, tilting the canvas under the bright conservation lights, trying to get a better angle. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a ghostly outline that didn't quite fit the rest of the painting's composition. She dismissed it for a moment as a trick of the light, perhaps a faint stain from an old spill, or a minor imperfection in the canvas itself. These things happen with old artworks. She made a mental note to examine it closer later, but continued her work, focusing on the broader task of cleaning. As the days turned into a week, and more of the old varnish was carefully stripped away, that faint anomaly began to clarify ever so slightly. It wasn't a trick of the light, it wasn't a stain. It was definitely a shape, a vague, irregular form hidden beneath the visible portrait. It seemed to stretch horizontally, just below the children's feet, like something had been painted there first, then covered up. Eleanor found herself returning to that spot more often, her brow furrowed in concentration. She picked at it with her eyes, trying to make sense of the faint lines. It was unsettling, not because it was alarming, but because it was unexpected. A professional painting of this caliber usually didn't have such crude, hidden elements. The feeling in the lab started to shift. It was nothing anyone could put into words, just a subtle change in the atmosphere. The usual easy chatter of the conservators grew quieter. Sometimes, Eleanor would catch herself staring at the painting, a strange sense of unease settling over her. It was as if the portrait, once so serene, now held a secret that was trying to push its way out. The children's eyes, which had initially seemed innocent, now held a faint, almost pained expression when viewed from certain angles. The stern patriarch's gaze felt less commanding and more watchful. It was all in her head, she told herself, a product of working too long on one piece, of finding an unexpected detail. But the feeling persisted, a low hum of discomfort that she couldn't shake. One afternoon during a break, she mentioned it to her colleague, Mark, a specialist in historical painting techniques. "Have you noticed anything odd about the Blackwood piece?" she asked casually, gesturing towards the canvas. Mark, who had been working on the other side of the room, walked over, coffee cup in hand. He squinted at the area she indicated. "Yeah, I saw that. Thought it was just some old repair. But it does look deliberate, doesn't it?" His confirmation solidified her own growing suspicions. This wasn't just a flaw. This was something purposefully hidden. The faint outline, now clearer than before, hinted at a shape that was completely out of place with the elegant family portrait. It looked rough, almost primitive, nothing like the refined style of the Blackwood family. The unease in the room wasn't just in her head. Mark felt it too. "We need to go deeper," Eleanor declared, her voice firm, cutting through the quiet hum of the lab. Her professional curiosity had now fully taken over, mixed with that persistent, unexplained sense of dread. "This isn't just a surface cleaning anymore. There's something under here, something important. We need to see what it is." She knew what that meant. infrared reflectography, and X-ray imaging, non-invasive techniques that could reveal hidden layers of paint without touching the surface. It was a bigger undertaking, more time-consuming, but the canvas was practically screaming for it. The serene portrait of the Blackwood family now felt like a closed door, and Eleanor knew she had to find out what lay behind it. The decision to use advanced imaging techniques was made quickly. The Blackwood portrait, carefully created, was moved from the main conservation lab to a specialized imaging room. The atmosphere there was different, more clinical, but the tension from the lab seemed to follow the painting. Eleanor and Mark oversaw the setup, a team of technicians quietly preparing the equipment. X-ray and infrared reflectography machines were calibrated, their sensors aimed at the canvas. There was a quiet anticipation in the room, a mix of scientific curiosity and that lingering, undefined dread. Everyone felt it, though no one spoke of it directly. The first set of images came from the infrared reflectography. This technique allowed them to see through the upper layers of paint, revealing charcoal underdrawings or earlier paint layers beneath. As the images processed, appearing on a large monitor, a collective gasp rippled through the small group. It wasn't just an underdrawing. It was an entirely distinct painting, crude and unsettling, directly beneath the serene Blackwood family. The initial faint outline Eleanor had spotted was just the tip of the iceberg. The hidden image was raw, almost primal. It lacked the fine detail and delicate brushwork of the visible portrait. Instead, it showed a distorted, almost grotesque figure, its features indistinct but undeniably disturbing. It wasn't a human face, nor was it an animal. It seemed to be a jumble of twisted lines and dark shapes, hinting at something monstrous. There were also strange, angular symbols surrounding it, almost like an ancient script, but unlike anything Eleanor or Mark had ever seen in art history. The figure dominated the lower half of the canvas, exactly where the Blackwood children were positioned in the top layer. It was as if the children were standing directly on top of this hidden horror. Then came the X-rays. X-rays could penetrate even deeper, revealing the underlying structure and any different pigments used. The X-ray images confirmed the infrared findings and added another layer of strangeness. The crude painting wasn't just a sketch. It was a fully realized, albeit unsettling, underpainting. The pigment choices for the hidden layer were also unusual, some appearing to be earth-based, others almost metallic, creating a stark contrast to the rich, vibrant colors of the Blackwood portrait above. It cemented the fact that this wasn't an accidental discard or a practice piece. This was intentional. Someone had painted this disturbing image, and then, with equal intent, painted over it. The mood in the imaging room shifted dramatically. The initial academic excitement faded, replaced by a palpable sense of unease that bordered on fear. The sterile, scientific environment now felt charged with something ancient and malevolent. The Blackwood family portrait, once an example of period elegance, now seemed to radiate a sinister aura. Its beauty felt like a deliberate deception, a mask hiding something truly terrifying. The serene faces of the Blackwoods, especially the children, now looked less innocent and more like unwitting participants in a dark secret. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She looked at Mark, and his face mirrored her own stunned expression. This was no longer just an art conservation project. This was something else entirely. The implications were immense. Why would someone paint such a disturbing image and then hide it beneath a family portrait? What was its purpose? Their immediate priority shifted from conservation to intense historical research. The team, now expanded to include several art historians and archivists, began a frenzied deep dive into the Blackwood family, the artist, and the painting's provenance. They scoured museum records, auction house catalogs, local historical societies, and even old newspaper archives. Every scrap of information about the Blackwood household, the artist who painted them, and the circumstances surrounding the commission became critical. They needed to find any clue, any hint that could explain this horrific revelation. Who were the Blackwoods, really? The museum's initial records described them as a prominent, well-respected family from the late 19th century, known for their philanthropy and social standing. But what if that was just the surface, just like the painting? What if their public image, like the portrait, was also a carefully constructed facade? The artist, a man named Arthur Finch, was initially believed to be a competent, if not groundbreaking, portrait painter of his time. But now, his name took on a new, unsettling significance. Had he been aware of the hidden layer? Had he painted it himself? Or was he merely covering up someone else's dark work? The questions piled up, each one more unsettling than the last. The initial joy of acquiring a valuable historical piece had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread and a chilling realization. They had not just acquired a painting, they had acquired a mystery, a puzzle with a terrifying secret at its heart, and that secret was now slowly, painstakingly being brought to light. The serene portrait was a lie, and the truth underneath was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The team's research into the Blackwood family history quickly peeled back the layers of their polished public image. What they found beneath was a tapestry woven with tragedy and unsettling rumors. The family, particularly in the late 1870s and early 1880s, seemed to have been plagued by a series of misfortunes that went far beyond typical hardships. There were whispers of a strange, lingering illness that affected the children, seemingly resistant to all medical treatments of the era. The family's once vibrant estate, nestled on the outskirts of the town, had slowly become isolated, its gates rarely opening for visitors. Neighbors spoke of sudden, unexplained disappearances among the household staff, often dismissed as workers simply moving on without notice, but the frequency was alarming. Eleanor and Mark, along with the historians, pored over dusty parish records, old police blotters, and even local gossip columns from the time. They found mentions of livestock dying mysteriously, crops failing without reason, and a general air of foreboding that settled over the Blackwood property. Local superstitions, usually confined to hushed conversations, seemed to take on a more urgent tone whenever the Blackwood name came up. People avoided the estate, believing it to be cursed or haunted. This stark contrast to the initial perception of a respected, affluent family was jarring and provided a chilling context for the hidden image. And then there was Arthur Finch, the artist. Their initial search for information about him had been surprisingly difficult. For someone commissioned by a family of the Blackwood standing, his records were unusually sparse. He seemed to have emerged from relative obscurity to paint this single, prominent portrait, and then, just as quickly, vanished from historical records. No subsequent commissions, no exhibitions, no mentions in art journals. It was as if he had painted the Blackwood family, and then ceased to exist as an artist. This sudden obscurity added another layer of mystery, making the team question if his disappearance was connected to the painting itself. Was he just a journeyman who moved on, or was there something more sinister at play? As the historians unearthed more about the Blackwood's misfortunes, the conservators continued their meticulous analysis of the hidden image. The synchronicity of their discoveries was unsettling. The crude, almost primal drawing beneath the family portrait wasn't just a random scribble. It seemed to resonate with the very folklore and tragic events surrounding the Blackwood estate. One afternoon, while reviewing enhanced images of the hidden layer, a specialist in historical symbols, brought in specifically for this purpose, gasped. She pointed to a series of interlocking lines and shapes within the hidden image that had been initially dismissed as part of its primitive nature. This, she explained, her voice hushed, is a variant of an ancient ward. It's not commonly known, thankfully. Used in very obscure regional occult practices. It's designed to bind, to trap something malevolent. The room fell silent. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating. A ward, a curse mark. Not just a drawing, but a ritualistic symbol meant to contain. The implications were staggering. The Blackwood family hadn't commissioned a simple portrait. They had commissioned a prison. The serene faces of the family above were not just a facade for public consumption, but a literal cover, a seal over something dark and dangerous. Eleanor felt a growing sense of foreboding tighten its grip on her. This wasn't merely a historical curiosity anymore. This was a direct link to a past filled with fear and desperation. The hidden painting wasn't a discarded sketch, nor was it a mistake. It was an integral, perhaps even the most integral part of the portrait's history. Its purpose was chillingly clear: to hold something back, to keep something contained. The artist, Arthur Finch, hadn't just been a painter, he had been a craftsman of containment. The team, once driven by academic curiosity, now moved with a palpable sense of dread. The serene 1882 family portrait, once a prized acquisition, had transformed into something entirely different, a relic of a desperate struggle against an unseen force. The Blackwood family's troubles, the artist's disappearance, the strange symbol, all converged into a single, terrifying narrative. The painting wasn't just a piece of art, it was a container, a silent sentinel guarding a secret that had been buried for over a century. And now, they, the conservators and historians, had inadvertently begun to unearth that secret, layer by painstaking layer. The understanding that the hidden image was a protective measure, rather than an accidental underpainting, added a profound weight to their discovery. They were no longer just studying history, they were uncovering a warning, a desperate act of preservation from a forgotten time. The question wasn't just what was hidden, but why it needed to be hidden so thoroughly, and what exactly it was that the Blackwoods and their mysterious artist had been so desperate to keep contained. The answers, they knew, would likely be far more terrifying than any of them could imagine. They had opened a door, and they were just beginning to see what lay on the other side. The search for answers intensified, a frantic scramble through dusty archives and forgotten records. Just when it seemed like all leads had gone cold, a small, unassuming box surfaced during a wider sweep of documents related to the Blackwood estate. Inside, among old property deeds and faded letters, were several fragments of what appeared to be a personal journal. The paper was brittle, the ink faint, but the handwriting was unmistakably that of Arthur Finch, the elusive artist. Eleanor carefully pieced together the scraps, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The entries were sporadic, sometimes only a few words, but they painted a chilling picture. Finch had been commissioned by Mr. Blackwood, not for a typical family portrait, but for something far more sinister. The journal spoke of a shadow that clung, a whispering presence that had latched onto the Blackwood children. Finch wrote of Mr. Blackwood's desperation, his pleas for a solution, anything to protect his family from the unseen entity that tormented them. The artist initially dismissed it as superstition, but the distress in Blackwood's eyes and the chilling accounts of the children's nightmares soon convinced him that something truly malevolent was at play. One entry detailed the true nature of the commission. He wants not a painting, but a prison, a seal against the darkness that consumes their joy. He believes the canvas can bind it. Finch, a man of science and art, found himself drawn into a world he didn't understand, a world of ancient fears and desperate rituals. He wrote about the immense pressure, the strange requests from Blackwood, who seemed to possess an unnatural knowledge of obscure containment methods. The patriarch provided him with specific instructions, symbols, and even a strange pungent pigment he insisted Finch use for the underlying layer. The journal confirmed their terrifying hypothesis. The crude, almost barbaric image beneath the Blackwood family portrait was no accidental underpainting. It was the prison, the ward, the seal that Finch had been forced to create. He described the process with growing horror, feeling as though he was not applying paint to canvas, but forging chains in a spiritual forge. He wrote of the entity's apparent resistance, the way the pigments seemed to writhe on the canvas as he painted the binding symbols, almost as if the hidden layer was alive. The family portrait, the serene facade they had discovered, was merely a final layer, a deceptively normal image meant to hold the seal in place, to fool anyone who might later look upon it. It was a visual lock, a seemingly mundane cover for a deeply sinister secret. Finch's entries grew increasingly frantic. He spoke of nightmares, of feeling watched, of the air growing cold around him, even in the studio. He believed the entity was aware of his work, that it was fighting back. He detailed the specific incantations and materials Blackwood had provided, things that sounded like they belonged in a forgotten grimoire rather than an artist's palette. He became convinced that the painting itself was a living trap, a vessel designed to contain something truly evil. The final entries were a desperate scramble of words, hinting at his terror. It is done. The cage is built, but the cost is too great. I must flee before it turns its gaze upon me, before it breaches the seal and finds me wanting. The journal abruptly ended there, a chilling testament to the artist's desperate flight. His subsequent disappearance from historical records, once a minor academic puzzle, now made perfect, terrifying sense. He hadn't simply faded into obscurity. He had run for his life, abandoning his career, his art, everything to escape whatever malevolent force he had helped to imprison. He understood the danger, the true nature of the Blackwood family's plight, and his own unwilling role in it. He had painted a prison, and then he had become its first fugitive. Eleanor and the team looked at the fragmented journal entries, then back at the projected image of the hidden ward, and finally at the seemingly innocent faces of the Blackwood family on the surface. The entire narrative of the painting had shifted. It wasn't just a portrait, it was a battleground, a testament to a desperate gamble against an unseen enemy. The artist wasn't just a painter, he was a reluctant warrior, forced to wield his brush as a weapon. And the Blackwood family, once seen as simply affluent patrons, were now victims, desperate to protect their children from a horror so profound it required a painted prison. The weight of this revelation pressed down on them. They had not merely uncovered a historical artifact, they had disturbed a centuries-old containment. And the question lingered, a chilling whisper in the quiet lab. Had their intervention, their meticulous conservation, inadvertently begun to weaken the very seal Finch had so desperately forged? The thought sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. They had opened a door, and now they were standing on the threshold of something truly terrifying. The fragments of Finch's journal were not just historical documents. They were a warning, a desperate plea from the past echoing into their present, begging them to understand the true gravity of what lay beneath the painted surface. The team knew they had to understand the hidden image even better now that they had Finch's journal. The crude drawing wasn't just some old sketch. It was the actual lock on a very dangerous cage. Eleanor decided they needed to push their imaging technology further, using every tool they had to see exactly what Finch had tried to imprison. They brought in the most advanced spectroscopic analysis equipment, the kind usually used for forensic studies, to peer beneath the layers of paint with even greater precision. The process was slow, painstaking, and required absolute stillness in the lab. Each tiny pixel of the hidden image was scanned, analyzed, and then pieced together by powerful computers. When the results finally came through, projected onto the large screen, a collective gasp went through the room. It wasn't just a symbol or a vague, unsettling shape. It was a face, a horrifying, distorted face. It was crude, yes, painted with what looked like desperate, hurried strokes, but the features were unmistakable. Two sunken, empty eye sockets stared out, wide and black. A gaping maw, filled with jagged, unequal teeth, seemed to stretch impossibly wide. Its skin, if one could call it that, appeared mottled and diseased, with strange dark veins visible beneath the surface. There was no nose, just two dark holes, and its ears were elongated, pointed, almost like a bat's, but twisted. It was a depiction of something utterly non-human, something that evoked a primal, instinctive fear. The lines of its face seemed to writhe, almost as if in pain or anger, even in a static image. It was a nightmare made real on canvas, a raw, terrifying impression of pure malevolence. Dr. Aris Thorne, the lead historian, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had seen countless historical images, many of them disturbing, but this was different. This wasn't a monster from folklore. This felt like a direct transmission of terror. He began frantically searching through the museum's archives, looking for anything that matched this grotesque image. He focused his search on the local history of the Blackwood Estates region, digging into old parish records, forgotten newspaper articles, and dusty collections of local legends. It didn't take long before he found fragmented references to something the locals had called the shadow blight, or the whispering sickness. These were not official medical terms, but common folk descriptions of a recurring affliction. Accounts spoke of children in the area becoming withdrawn, suffering from terrible nightmares, hearing voices and developing an inexplicable, profound fear of shadows. The sickness often preceded strange disappearances or sudden, unexplained illnesses that baffled doctors. The descriptions were vague, almost superstitious, but the common thread was always the children, and a sense of an unseen presence that fed on their fear. The terrifying face on the hidden canvas, Aris realized, was a visual representation of that blight, a physical manifestation of the terror that had haunted the region. Eleanor, still reeling from the image of the entity, turned her attention back to the visible Blackwood family portrait. She looked at the children, their faces once seeming merely serious, almost stoic, as was common in portraits of that era. But now, with the new context, she saw something else. Their eyes, once just dark reflections, now seemed too wide, too hollow. There was a subtle tension in their small shoulders, a slight tremor in the set of their mouths that she had dismissed as an artistic quirk, or simply the difficulty of holding a pose for a long time. But now, it looked like distress, a silent, enduring fear. Their hands, clasped in their parents', seemed to grip a little too tightly, as if seeking reassurance that wasn't quite there. It was as if the artist, even while painting the facade, couldn't entirely hide the torment the children were enduring. They were not just subjects, they were victims, their innocence slowly being eroded by the persistent, shadowy influence of the entity Finch had painted beneath them. They were the targets, the vulnerable points where the shadow blight had taken hold. The museum staff, who had initially approached the project with academic detachment, were now deeply unsettled. The initial skepticism about Finch's journal entries, about the idea of a painting being a prison for a malevolent entity, had completely vanished. The horrifying image on the screen, coupled with the historical accounts and the reinterpretation of the children's faces, had changed everything. The portrait, once a valuable piece of art, a historical treasure, now felt like a ticking time bomb. It was no longer just an object of study. It was a container for something potentially dangerous, something that had caused real suffering. Whispers began to circulate among the staff. Some suggested it should be destroyed, others that it should be locked away in a vault, never to be seen again. The idea of displaying it to the public, of allowing visitors to stand before a painting that contained such a palpable evil, sparked heated debates. The museum director, a practical man who usually dealt with budgets and public relations, found himself in an impossible position, grappling with a problem that went far beyond art history. The painting had become a liability, a source of dread, and a profound ethical dilemma. They had stumbled upon a secret that perhaps should have remained buried, and now they had to figure out what to do with it before it was too late. The museum, once a quiet sanctuary of history and art, began to feel different. A subtle shift in its atmosphere became noticeable, particularly around the conservation lab where the Blackwood portrait was held. It started with small things, easily dismissed at first. Lights in the hallway outside the lab would flicker erratically, even after electricians checked the wiring multiple times. Staff members reported unexplained cold spots, sudden drops in temperature that would send a shiver down their spines, even in a perfectly climate-controlled environment. Sometimes, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper would seem to drift through the air, just beyond the edge of hearing, like a secret being told to no one in particular. Objects would be subtly moved overnight. A pen left on a desk would be found on the floor, a stack of papers slightly askew. No one could explain it, and initially everyone tried to rationalize these incidents as faulty old building infrastructure or overworked imaginations. But as the days turned into weeks and the team continued their intense study of the Blackwood portrait, these strange occurrences grew more frequent and more unsettling. The psychological toll on the staff was becoming evident. Oris, who had been so enthusiastic at the beginning, found himself plagued by vivid, unsettling nightmares. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, unable to recall the specifics but left with a crushing sense of dread. Eleanor, usually calm and composed, found herself experiencing heightened anxiety, a constant knot in her stomach that tightened whenever she was near the lab. She felt an almost physical sensation of being watched, a prickling on the back of her neck that wouldn't go away. Some of the junior conservators developed a pronounced, almost irrational fear of the portrait itself. They'd avoid making eye contact with it, preferring to work with their backs turned or find excuses to be in other parts of the museum. The once esteemed painting was now a source of palpable discomfort, turning a professional workplace into something akin to a house of horrors. The museum director, still grappling with the ethical dilemma, made a temporary decision, citing unforeseen conservation challenges and the need for specialized environmental controls. The Blackwood portrait was quietly removed from public display. This official statement, however, did little to quell the growing buzz of rumors. Staff members, both those directly involved and others who had only heard snippets, whispered about the painting's unsettling nature. Stories of the flickering lights, the cold spots, and the strange whispers began to circulate, morphing into more exaggerated tales with each retelling. The local community, ever sensitive to the undercurrents of the historic museum, soon picked up on the unease. People who had visited the exhibit before its closure spoke of feeling a strange chill or a sense of foreboding when looking at the Blackwood family, even before any of the discoveries were made. The painting was quickly building a reputation, not as a masterpiece, but as something else entirely, something cursed. The phenomena around the painting, now isolated in a secure, climate-controlled room within the lab, continued to escalate. The subtle manifestations of the entity became more distinct. On several occasions, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow was seen flitting in the periphery of vision near the painting. It wasn't a solid form, more like a distortion in the air, a momentary darkening that vanished as soon as one tried to focus on it. It was like a trick of light, but it happened too often and too consistently to be dismissed. The most unsettling change, however, was in the portrait itself. The children's eyes, those wide, hollow eyes that Eleanor had re-evaluated, now seemed to follow anyone who moved within the room. It was an optical illusion, everyone knew, a common trick of portraiture. But this felt different. It felt personal, a gaze that was not merely following but observing, judging, perhaps even influencing. The expressions on their painted faces seemed to subtly shift, a fleeting hint of fear, or perhaps something more sinister that was never quite there when directly observed. The team, now thoroughly convinced that Finch's prison theory was accurate, faced a terrifying realization. Their meticulous conservation efforts, their advanced imaging techniques, their very act of revealing the hidden layer might have inadvertently weakened the seal. The artist, in his desperation, had created a crude but seemingly effective containment system. By stripping away layers of varnish, by exposing the underlying terror to light and scrutiny, they might have compromised its integrity. The prison was not just the hidden painting, it was the entire structure, the layers, the intention behind it. Each analysis, each photograph, each discussion about the entity was like chipping away at the walls of its painted cell. The strange incidents, the psychological impact, the subtle manifestations, these were not just random occurrences. They were signs that the entity was stirring, that it was gaining strength, and that Finch's desperate attempt to bind it was slowly but surely failing. The Blackwood portrait was no longer just an artifact. It was a living, breathing problem, and they had, in their pursuit of knowledge, inadvertently opened the door to something truly horrifying. The dilemma of containment weighed heavily on everyone, a silent, growing dread that permeated the very air of the museum. The strange occurrences, which had once been subtle and easily dismissed, now intensified dramatically around the Blackwood portrait. It was no longer just flickering lights. Now, electrical equipment near the painting would malfunction violently, sparking and buzzing before dying completely. Security alarms, designed to detect even the slightest movement, would trigger without any apparent cause, their piercing wails echoing through the empty museum halls in the dead of night. The whispers, which had previously been indistinct and fleeting, became clearer, more insistent. Staff members reported hearing their names called, or fragments of unsettling phrases, seemingly emanating from the room where the portrait was kept. It was as if the air itself was charged with a malevolent energy, growing stronger with each passing day. Physical manifestations began to appear, small but undeniable. Inexplicable scratches marred the polished wooden floorboards near the painting, deep gouges that no one could account for. On one occasion, a conservator found scorch marks on a metal trolley that had been left too close to the canvas, despite there being no heat source nearby. The most chilling physical change was the sudden, localized temperature drops. The air around the portrait would become noticeably colder, heavier, sometimes even leaving a thin layer of frost on nearby surfaces, even in a climate-controlled environment. It was a cold that bit to the bone, a profound chill that felt unnatural, draining the warmth from the room and anyone within it. The visible Blackwood family portrait, once a perfectly preserved piece of art, also began to show signs of this escalating influence. It started subtly, with colors seeming to fade unevenly, almost as if draining from certain areas of the canvas. Then, fine cracks began to spread across the paint surface, not in the typical patterns of age, but in unnatural, almost spiderweb-like formations that seemed to pulse and shift when viewed closely. It was as if the canvas itself was straining against an internal pressure, the beautiful facade struggling to contain something powerful and destructive. The children's faces, already unnerving, now seemed to twist further, their painted expressions morphing into something more anguished, more desperate than before. The lines around their eyes deepened, their mouths seemed to downturn, reflecting a silent, painted scream. The team, now gripped by a collective dread, fully understood the grim reality. The seal was failing. Finch's desperate artifice, the artist's crude but effective prison, was not just weakening, it was actively being breached. The entity, once contained and merely stirring, was now exerting a more direct and forceful influence, attempting to break free from its painted prison with increasing intensity. The subtle shifts in the children's faces, the deepening anguish in their painted eyes, were no longer just a trick of light or imagination. They were a direct reflection of the entity's growing strength, its struggle against the bonds that held it, and its imminent escape. The Blackwood portrait was no longer just an object of study, it was a battleground, and the entity was winning. In a desperate attempt to regain control, the museum leadership, now thoroughly convinced of the supernatural nature of their problem, made an unprecedented decision. They reached out beyond the usual academic and scientific circles. Experts in paranormal phenomena were secretly consulted, individuals who dealt with the unseen, the unexplained. Historians specialized in obscure occult practices, and ancient containment rituals were brought in, their knowledge spanning centuries of human attempts to grapple with forces beyond understanding. The hope was to find a way to reinforce the seal, to somehow mend the failing prison, or at the very least, to understand how to recontain the entity before it fully escaped. Time was running out. Every new manifestation, every chilling whisper, every inexplicable cold spot was a stark reminder that they were not just dealing with an old painting, but with a living, malevolent force on the verge of breaking free. The museum, usually a bastion of logic and reason, was now a place of fear, a stage for a silent, terrifying struggle between art, history, and something ancient and evil. The weight of their past decisions, their accidental liberation of this entity, pressed down on them all, a suffocating burden of responsibility. They knew, with absolute certainty, that if the entity escaped, the consequences would be catastrophic, far beyond the walls of the museum. The silence in the room where the portrait lay was no longer peaceful, but thick with menace, a countdown to an unknown horror. The desperate attempts to reinforce the ancient seal, to somehow mend the failing prison within the canvas, proved tragically futile. The gathered experts, with their varied backgrounds in the esoteric and the scientific, found their methods either completely ineffective or worse, actively provoked the entity. Each incantation, each technological scan, Each historical ritual performed around the Blackwood portrait seemed to fuel the malevolent force, leading to a terrifying crescendo of activity that shook the museum to its very foundations. The air grew impossibly cold, the whispers morphed into guttural growls, and objects began to fly from shelves with violent force. Lights exploded, plunging the room into momentary darkness, only to flicker back on, revealing the growing chaos. It was clear that whatever containment the artist had painstakingly created was now irrevocably broken. Then it happened, not with a bang, but with a terrifying, instantaneous silence. A profound, crushing pressure descended upon the room, a wave of pure, unadulterated dread that stole the breath from every person present. The temperature plummeted to an unbearable, unnatural chill, causing frost to bloom on metal surfaces, and the very air to crystallize around them. It felt as if a vast, unseen vacuum had suddenly opened, sucking all warmth, all light, all hope from the space. There was no visible monster, no dramatic explosion of color or form, just that absolute, suffocating presence, a feeling of being completely overwhelmed by an ancient predatory intelligence. A collective gasp, a unified shiver of primal terror ran through the team. They didn't see it leave, but they knew, with an instinct far deeper than logic, that it was gone. The entity was free. When the oppressive feeling finally lifted, leaving behind only the lingering icy cold, everyone slowly turned their gaze back to the Blackwood portrait. It was irrevocably altered, a grotesque mockery of its former self. The beautiful facade, once an idyllic family scene, was now a ruin. Great jagged cracks, black as pitch, ran across the canvas, like wounds inflicted by an unseen claw. Patches of the vibrant oil paint had flaked away, revealing more of the crude, terrifying depiction of the entity beneath. It wasn't fully exposed, but enough was visible to confirm the artist's desperate warnings. A distorted mouth, an empty, burning eye, a hint of a skeletal limb, all pushed through the ruined family portrait, no longer fully hidden, asserting its presence. The children's faces, once merely anguished, were now contorted in expressions of pure, silent horror, their painted eyes wide and black, reflecting the very essence of the thing that had once tormented them. The mother's serene smile was now a ghastly grimace, and the stern patriarch's gaze was one of abject terror, as if they were all caught in a perpetual, painted scream. The museum, reeling from the traumatic events and faced with an object that was not only dangerous but now physically repulsive, made the only decision it could. The Blackwood portrait, once a prized acquisition, was deemed too perilous to ever be displayed again. It was carefully, almost ritualistically, removed from the exhibition hall, not destroyed for fear of further provoking the entity or breaking some unknown rule, but sealed away. A specially constructed vault, reinforced with lead and iron, located deep within the museum's forgotten catacombs, became its tomb. The vault was then consecrated by various religious figures, a desperate, symbolic act to try and contain what could not be contained, to create a barrier against a force that had proven itself capable of transcending physical boundaries. The location was kept secret, known only to a handful of high-ranking museum officials who carried the burden of its existence like a curse. The portrait was to be forgotten, never to be seen again by human eyes, a grim testament to a horror best left undisturbed. The story concluded with a chilling, unsettling realization. The entity had been freed, the fate of the Blackwood family, the artist's true sacrifice in attempting to bind it, and the potential for the entity to manifest elsewhere, in other homes, other lives, remained chillingly open. The museum staff, though physically unharmed, carried the invisible scars of profound dread, forever changed by their encounter with the unseen. They understood now that some historical artifacts were not merely objects of study, but vessels of ancient power, capable of unleashing unspeakable terror. The world, they knew, was a fragile place, and beneath its familiar surface lurked shadows of unimaginable depth. The Blackwood portrait, though hidden, cast a long, cold shadow over their lives, a constant, silent reminder that some horrors, once awakened, never truly disappear. They were left with the profound, unsettling understanding that some things are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep in the past, lest they rise again to haunt the present. The lingering threat was a whisper on the wind, a chill in the air, a constant reminder that the entity once contained now roamed free.